The shovel bit into the hard-packed earth with a sound like breaking bones. Each strike sent shockwaves through Sarah's trembling arms as she dug deeper into the unforgiving ground behind the abandoned schoolhouse. The moon hung heavy and red above the Colorado territory, casting everything in the color of blood, fitting, she thought, for what she was about to bury. Her son's small body lay wrapped in her wedding dress, the only clean white fabric she had left. Little Thomas, barely 5 years old, his golden hair still matted with dirt and worse things she couldn't bear to think about. The Comanche war party had come at dawn, swift and merciless, but it wasn't their arrows that had killed her boy. It was something far worse, something that wore a human face. Sarah's tears had long since dried, leaving only salt tracks on her weathered cheeks. She worked by the crimson moonlight, her calloused hands blistering around the wooden handle. When the hole was deep enough, she gently lowered her child into the earth, whispering a prayer her grandmother had taught her in the old country. "Sleep now, my darling," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that swept across the prairie. "Mama will make this right." But making it right would prove more difficult than she ever imagined. 3 days later, Sarah sat in the makeshift jail cell they'd fashioned from old Pete's barn, her wrists raw from the rope bonds. The good people of Redemption Creek had listened to her story with skeptical eyes and pursed lips. A Comanche raid that left only her child dead, a mysterious stranger who'd fled into the night. They'd found no other bodies, no proof of any attack save for the word of a woman already known for her peculiar ways. "She's always been touched in the head," muttered Mrs. Abernathy, the preacher's wife, as she passed by the barn with her basket of eggs. "Living alone out there with that boy, no husband to keep her in line. Mark my words, she killed that child herself." The whispers grew louder each day. Infanticide, they called it, the ultimate sin. Judge Hartwell would arrive from Denver in 2 days, and Sarah knew what verdict he would deliver. She'd seen it in the eyes of every person who'd looked at her since they'd dragged her from her homestead. Guilt was written in their faces, not hers but theirs, for they'd already decided her fate. Sheriff Morrison, a decent man worn down by years of frontier justice, brought her water and hardtack each morning. He never met her eyes, but she could see the doubt gnawing at him. "Sarah," he said on the 4th morning, his voice heavy with reluctance, "if you were to confess, tell folks it was an accident maybe, or that you were unwell. Judge Hartwell might show mercy, life in prison instead of—" "I won't lie about my boy's death," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her chest. "Thomas deserves better than that." Morrison sighed and left her alone with her thoughts and the rats that scurried through the hay. The blood moon rose again that night, casting the world in its supernatural glow. Sarah had been counting the days, remembering her grandmother's stories about such nights when the veil between worlds grew thin, when old debts came due, when impossible things became possible. She was dozing fitfully when she heard the soft creak of the barn door. Her eyes snapped open, expecting to see Sheriff Morrison, or perhaps one of the townspeople come to deliver their own version of justice before the judge arrived. Instead, she saw a figure that seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves. He was tall and lean, with the kind of build that spoke of years spent in the saddle. His hair was black as a moonless night, braided with small bones and feathers that caught the red light filtering through the barn's gaps. His skin was the color of burnished copper, and his eyes, those eyes were like chips of obsidian, holding depths that seemed to contain the wisdom and pain of generations. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his moccasined feet making no sound on the straw-covered floor. A knife appeared in his hand as if by magic, and Sarah found herself holding her breath, uncertain whether he'd come as salvation or as death. "You are the woman who buried her child," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who'd learned English as a second tongue. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who are you?" "I am called Nighthawk," he replied, approaching her slowly, like one might approach a wounded animal. "I have been watching this town for 3 days, learning its secrets, understanding its lies." The knife moved to her bonds, and Sarah felt the rope fall away from her wrists. She rubbed the circulation back into her hands, never taking her eyes off the stranger. "Why?" she whispered. Nighthawk crouched beside her, and in the red moonlight, she could see the intricate tattoos that covered his arms and chest, symbols that told stories of battles fought and honors earned. "Because I know who killed your son." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd suspected, hoped, prayed that someone would believe her, but to hear it confirmed felt like resurrection and damnation rolled into one. "Tell me," she breathed. "Colonel Marcus Thornfield," Nighthawk said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "He leads a group of men who dress as Comanche, who raid isolated homesteads and leave no witnesses. They take what they want, livestock, valuables, women, and blame it on my people." Sarah's blood turned to ice. She knew the name. Colonel Thornfield was a respected man in these parts, a Civil War hero who'd come west to make his fortune. He owned the largest spread in 3 counties and had the ear of the territorial governor. "You're lying," she whispered, but even as she said it she knew he wasn't. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity, the way the Comanche had moved, the strange quiet that had fallen over the town after the attack, the way no one had wanted to look too closely at the evidence. "I have been hunting him for 2 years, Nighthawk continued. He killed my sister, my nephew, many others. Always the same story. Comanche raids that leave no survivors except those who can be useful to him." "Then why don't you just kill him?" Sarah asked, surprised by the venom in her own voice. Nighthawk's smile was sharp as a blade. "Because I gave a blood oath to my dying father. Thornfield must face justice for his crimes, but it must be justice that the white man's world will accept. He must be exposed, brought down by his own laws, his own people." Sarah stared at him, understanding beginning to dawn. "You need a witness. I need someone who has lost everything to his evil, someone who can speak the truth, even when death waits for her words." Nighthawk's eyes locked with hers. "I need you." The barn fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the gaps in the walls. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her shoulders. "If I help you," she said slowly, "what happens to me? The town already thinks I'm a child killer. If I escape, I'll be a fugitive." "Perhaps," Nighthawk acknowledged. "But you'll be a living fugitive with a chance to see justice done. Here you'll be a dead woman with her son's killer still walking free." Sarah closed her eyes, seeing Thomas's face in her mind, his gap-toothed grin, the way he'd chased fireflies in the summer evenings, the trust in his eyes when he'd asked her to read him just one more story before bed. When she opened them again, her decision was made. "What do you need me to do?" They rode through the night, Sarah clinging to the back of Nighthawk's horse as they moved across the moonlit prairie. He rode like he'd been born to it, his mount seeming to know the way, even in the darkness. Sarah had never been on a horse moving so fast, and the exhilaration mixed with terror in her chest until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "Where are we going?" she called over the wind. "To gather proof," Nighthawk replied. "Thornfield's men are planning another raid tomorrow night. We're going to be there when they do." They rode for hours, the blood moon tracking across the sky above them. Sarah's legs ached from gripping the horse's flanks, and her arms burned from holding onto Nighthawk's waist, but she didn't complain. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt like she was moving towards something instead of just running away. As dawn approached, they stopped at a small cave hidden in a cluster of rocks. Nighthawk helped her down from the horse, and Sarah's legs nearly buckled as her feet touched the ground. "Rest," he said, leading the horse to a trickle of water that ran between the stones. "Tonight, we make our stand." Sarah settled herself against the cave wall, watching as Nighthawk tended to his horse with gentle efficiency. There was something about the way he moved, the careful attention he paid to the animal's needs, that reminded her of her father. "You're not what I expected," she said after a while. Nighthawk glanced at her, one eyebrow raised. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something more savage, I suppose." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sorry. That was foolish of me." "No more foolish than me expecting all white women to be like the ones who spit on me in town," Nighthawk replied, settling down across from her. "We are all more than what others expect us to be." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Sarah found herself studying Nighthawk's face, noting the laugh lines around his eyes, the small scar that ran along his jaw, the way he seemed to carry himself with both confidence and careful watchfulness. "What was your sister's name?" she asked quietly. "Morning Star," he replied, his voice soft with memory. "She was younger than me but braver. She died protecting her son, my nephew. They were, as am I, for your loss." Nighthawk's gaze met hers. "Grief is a strange thing. It can destroy us, or it can forge us into something stronger. Which do you think it's done to us?" Nighthawk was quiet for a long moment. "I think we'll find out tonight." The Larson homestead sat in a valley about 20 miles from Redemption Creek. Sarah had known Eric and Ingrid Larson by reputation. Good people, hard-working, trying to make a life for themselves and their 3 young children in the harsh territory. As she and Nighthawk crouched in the rocks above the small cabin, watching the smoke rise from the chimney, Sarah's heart clenched with the knowledge of what was coming. "We can't just let them die," she whispered urgently. "We won't," Nighthawk replied, checking his rifle, "but we must let them come. If we warn the Larsons, Thornfield's men will simply choose another target, and we'll lose our chance to expose them." The waiting was agony. Sarah watched the cabin windows glow with lamplight, saw the shadow figures of the family moving about their evening routines. She thought of Thomas, of the evening he'd died, of how normal everything had seemed until the moment it wasn't. "There," Nighthawk breathed, pointing toward the northern ridge. Sarah followed his gaze and saw them, dark shapes moving against the twilight sky. Even from a distance she could see they were dressed to look like Comanche warriors, complete with feathers and war paint. But their movements were wrong, too deliberate, too organized. These weren't raiders driven by desperation or revenge. These were soldiers following orders. How many? Sarah whispered. 8, maybe 9. Nighthawk's voice was grim. More than I expected. The attack came swiftly. The false Comanche swept down from the ridge with wild whoops and battle cries that echoed across the valley. Sarah watched in horror as they surrounded the cabin, firing shots into the air to spread panic rather than striking to kill immediately. They want them alive, Nighthawk said, his voice tight with controlled anger. At least some of them. The cabin door burst open, and Erik Larson stumbled out with his hands raised, pleading for his family's lives. Behind him came Ingrid, clutching their baby while their 2 older children clung to her skirts. The sight of the family's terror sent a wave of rage through Sarah that nearly blinded her. Now, she hissed, starting to rise. Nighthawk's hand clamped down on her arm. Not yet. We need to see their leader. As if summoned by his words, another rider appeared on the ridge. This one sat tall and proud on a magnificent black stallion, and even from a distance Sarah could see the military bearing that marked him as clearly as a uniform. Colonel Marcus Thornfield had come to oversee his handiwork personally. Murderer, Sarah breathed, her hands clenching into fists. Below, the false raid continued its grisly theater. The men were sorting through the family now. The older children were herded toward the barn while Ingrid and her baby were dragged toward the horses. Erik fought to reach his wife, and was struck down with a rifle butt for his efforts. I can't watch this, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. You must, Nighthawk replied, though his own voice was strained. You must see it all, remember every detail. This is what you'll tell the judge, the jury, anyone who will listen. One of the false warriors approached Thornfield, and even across the distance, Sarah could hear the man's voice carrying on the wind. Colonel, what about the man? Thornfield's reply was clear and cold. No witnesses. Make it look like he died defending his family. The shot that killed Erik Larson echoed across the valley like thunder. Sarah bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood in her mouth. She watched as Thornfield's men loaded Ingrid and her baby onto horses, then set fire to the cabin. The 2 older children. Where are the other children? Sarah whispered frantically. Nighthawk's face was grim. They're saving them for later. Children are valuable in certain markets. The full horror of what she was witnessing crashed over Sarah like a wave. This wasn't just murder. It was something far more monstrous. These men were slavers, using the cover of Indian raids to steal women and children for purposes she didn't want to imagine. As the false war party rode away with their captives, Thornfield lingered for a moment, surveying the burning cabin with evident satisfaction. Then he too turned his horse and disappeared into the darkness. We have to follow them, Sarah said, her voice hoarse with emotion. Yes, Nighthawk agreed, but carefully. They're going to their base camp, and that's where we'll find the evidence to hang them all. The trail led deep into the Badlands, through rocky canyons and hidden passes that seemed to know no human foot had ever trod. Nighthawk followed the tracks with an expertise that amazed Sarah. Every broken twig, every displaced stone told him a story she couldn't read. They traveled through the night, their horses picking their way carefully over the treacherous terrain. Sarah found herself pressed close against Nighthawk's back, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his body in the cold night air. Despite everything, the horror they'd witnessed, the danger they were riding toward, she felt safer than she had in years. There, Nighthawk whispered as they crested a ridge. Below them, hidden in a box canyon, lay a camp that told the story of months, perhaps years, of organized terror. Canvas tents were arranged in military precision around a central fire pit. Corrals held stolen livestock, and a large tent near the back of the camp glowed with lamplight. But it was the smaller structures that made Sarah's blood run cold. Cages, crude but effective, holding human figures huddled in the darkness. My God, she breathed. How many? Too many, Nighthawk replied, and we're too late for some of them. Sarah could see what he meant. Some of the cages were empty, their doors hanging open. She didn't want to think about what had happened to their former occupants. We need to get closer, Nighthawk said, and we need proof that will stand up in court. They left the horses hidden in the rocks and made their way down into the canyon on foot. Nighthawk moved like a ghost, and Sarah did her best to follow his example, though every step seemed to sound like thunder to her ears. The camp was quieter than she'd expected. Most of the men were apparently asleep, though she could see guards posted at strategic points. The large tent at the back of the camp was their obvious target. If Thornfield kept records of his operations, they would be there. They reached the tent without being detected, and Nighthawk produced a knife to cut a slit in the canvas. Sarah peered through the opening and gasped. The tent was set up like a field office, complete with a desk, filing cabinets, and maps of the territory marked with red X's. Jackpot, Nighthawk whispered. They slipped inside, and Sarah immediately began rifling through the papers on the desk while Nighthawk kept watch. What she found made her stomach turn. Detailed records of raids, inventories of stolen goods, and worst of all, a ledger that listed human beings like livestock, names, ages, physical descriptions, and prices paid by buyers back east. "This is it," she whispered, holding up a document that bore Thornfield's signature. "This is enough to hang him 10 times over." A sound outside made them both freeze. Footsteps approaching the tent. Nighthawk gestured for Sarah to hide behind the filing cabinet while he pressed himself against the tent wall. The tent flap opened, and Colonel Thornfield himself stepped inside, still wearing his false Comanche disguise. He was a tall man, well-built, with the kind of face that would have been handsome if not for the cruelty that twisted his features. He moved to the desk and began sorting through papers, apparently unaware that anything was amiss. Sarah held her breath, clutching the incriminating documents to her chest. This close to Thornfield, she could smell the smoke from the Larson cabin on his clothes, could see the dried blood on his hands. The man who had killed her son was close enough to touch. The rage that had been building in her for days finally boiled over. Without thinking, she stepped out from behind the filing cabinet. "You killed my boy," she said, her voice carrying across the tent like a judgment. Thornfield spun around, his hand going to his gun, but Nighthawk was already moving. The two men collided in the center of the tent, grappling for Thornfield's weapon. Sarah watched in horror as they rolled across the floor, each fighting for advantage. "The evidence," Nighthawk shouted. "Get it out of here." Sarah clutched the papers and started for the tent opening, but Thornfield's voice stopped her cold. "One more step and I'll kill him," he said. Sarah turned to see Thornfield holding a knife to Nighthawk's throat. Both men were breathing hard, their clothes torn from the struggle. "You're the woman from Redemption Creek," Thornfield said, his eyes glittering with recognition. "The one who murdered her own child." "I didn't kill Thomas," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "You did, just like you killed the Larson family tonight." Thornfield laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Prove it. Who's going to believe a crazy woman and a half-breed savage against a decorated officer of the United States Army?" "Everyone," Sarah replied, holding up the papers. "When they see these records, when they hear what we witnessed tonight, they'll know the truth." The knife pressed deeper into Nighthawk's throat, drawing a thin line of blood. "Drop those papers, or I'll cut his throat and tell everyone you killed him too." Sarah looked into Nighthawk's eyes and saw something there that gave her strength, trust, faith, the kind of bond that could only be forged in the fires of shared purpose. "No," she said simply. Thornfield's face twisted with rage. "You stupid." His words were cut off as Nighthawk drove his elbow back into the colonel's ribs. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs, but this time Sarah was ready. She grabbed a heavy candlestick from the desk and brought it down on Thornfield's head with all the force she could muster. The colonel went limp, and Nighthawk pushed himself free, gasping for air. "Is he dead?" Sarah asked, staring down at Thornfield's still form. "Unconscious," Nighthawk replied, checking for a pulse. "But not for long. We need to move." "What about the prisoners?" "We'll free them, but we need help. This evidence," he gestured to the papers Sarah still clutched. "This changes everything. We need to get it to someone who can act on it." They worked quickly, freeing the terrified captives from their cages and helping them escape into the night. The Larson children were among them, traumatized but alive. Sarah held the youngest close, thinking of Thomas, of all the children who hadn't been so lucky. By the time Thornfield's men realized what was happening, Sarah and Nighthawk were already leading the freed prisoners out of the canyon. Behind them, the camp erupted in chaos as the colonel's men tried to organize a pursuit. "There's a cavalry outpost 2 days' ride east," Nighthawk said as they pushed their makeshift caravan as hard as they dared. "If we can reach it, we'll reach it," Sarah said with grim determination. "We have to." The next 3 days were a blur of hard riding, little sleep, and constant fear. Thornfield's men pursued them relentlessly, but Nighthawk's knowledge of the terrain kept them one step ahead. The freed prisoners, mostly women and children, showed a courage that humbled Sarah. Despite their ordeal, they pressed on without complaint, understanding that their freedom and their lives depended on reaching safety. On the 4th morning, they crested a hill and saw the blessed sight of the American flag flying over Fort Collins. The cavalry patrol that rode out to meet them was led by a young lieutenant who took one look at the bedraggled group and immediately escorted them to the commanding officer. Colonel James Harrison was a career soldier, gray-haired and weathered by years of frontier service. He listened to Sarah's story with growing amazement and anger, examining the documents she'd taken from Thornfield's tent with the eye of a man who understood their significance. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "These records detail crimes spanning 2 years, involving dozens of victims. If this is authentic, it's authentic," Sarah said firmly. "We were there. We saw them kill Eric Larson in cold blood." Colonel Harrison looked at Nighthawk, who had remained silent during Sarah's recitation. "And you, sir? What's your part in this?" "I am the son of Chief Standing Bear of the Lakota people," Nighthawk replied with quiet dignity. "These men killed my sister and nephew 2 years ago. I have been hunting them ever since." "A blood oath," Harrison said, nodding slowly. "I understand. And you're willing to testify to what you witnessed?" "I am." Harrison looked back at Sarah. "Mrs. Donovan, you realize that if you testify against Thornfield, you'll be admitting to escaping from custody. You'll face charges for that." Sarah met his gaze steadily. My son is dead because of that man. I'll face whatever consequences come from telling the truth. The colonel was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. I'll send word to the territorial governor immediately. This case will need to be handled at the highest levels. The trial of Colonel Marcus Thornfield became the most sensational legal proceeding in the history of the Colorado Territory. Newspaper reporters came from as far away as New York to cover the proceedings, and the courtroom was packed every day with spectators eager to hear the testimony. Sarah took the stand on the third day, wearing a simple black dress that one of the army wives had given her. As she told her story, the attack on her home, the death of her son, her imprisonment and escape, the courtroom was so quiet that her words seemed to echo off the walls. And you're certain, asked the prosecutor, that the man who led the attack on the Larson homestead was the defendant, Colonel Thornfield? I am certain, Sarah replied, her voice clear and strong. I saw him give the order to kill Eric Larson. I heard him say no witnesses with my own ears. The defense attorney, a slick-haired man from Denver, tried to discredit her testimony by painting her as a grief-stricken woman who had invented an elaborate fantasy to avoid responsibility for her son's death. But the evidence was overwhelming. The documents, the testimony of the freed prisoners, and most damning of all, the confession of one of Thornfield's men who had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. When Nighthawk took the stand, his testimony was delivered with the calm authority of a man who had seen too much death to be intimidated by a courtroom. He described in detail the systematic nature of Thornfield's operations, the way the false raids were planned and executed, the horror of the slave camp hidden in the Badlands. The defense attorney made the mistake of questioning Nighthawk's credibility based on his mixed heritage. Can the jury really trust the word of a half-breed Indian against that of a decorated army officer? Nighthawk's response was delivered with icy calm. My blood is mixed, it's true, half Lakota, half Irish. But my word is not mixed, it is simply true. Colonel Thornfield is a murderer and a slaver, and all the medals in the world cannot change that fact. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Judge Hartwell, the same man who had come to Redemption Creek to oversee Sarah's execution, pronounced sentence with visible satisfaction. Colonel Marcus Thornfield, you have been found guilty of murder, kidnapping, slavery, and conspiracy. The court sentences you to death by hanging, to be carried out 1 week from today. As the bailiffs led Thornfield away, he caught sight of Sarah in the gallery. His face was twisted with rage and defeat. This isn't over, he snarled. There are others. There are indeed others, Judge Hartwell interrupted, and they will be found and prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The week following the trial was strange for Sarah. She was technically still a fugitive, but the territorial governor had made it clear that no charges would be filed against her. The people of Redemption Creek, faced with the undeniable evidence of her innocence, had sent a delegation to offer their apologies. She accepted them graciously, but she knew she could never go back to that life. She stood on the steps of the courthouse the morning of Thornfield's execution, not to watch him die but to bear witness to the justice that had finally been served. Thomas would never come back, but his death had not been in vain. The other children, the ones who had been saved, and the ones who would be saved in the future, would live because of what they had accomplished. Nighthawk appeared at her side as the sun rose over the mountains. His blood oath was fulfilled, his family's deaths avenged, but Sarah could see that the completion of his quest had left him hollow rather than satisfied. What will you do now? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and red. I don't know. For 2 years, hunting Thornfield was all I lived for. Now you have to learn to live for something else. They stood in comfortable silence, two souls who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances. Sarah thought about the future, about the choices that lay ahead of her. She had no home to return to, no family left, no clear path forward. But for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something she had thought was lost forever. Hope. I've been thinking, she said quietly, about what you said about grief, about how it can destroy us or forge us into something stronger. Yes, I think it's done both to us, destroyed who we were, forged us into who we needed to be. She turned to look at him, this man who had risked everything to save her, who had helped her find justice for her son. The question is, what do we do with who we've become? Nighthawk's smile was the first genuine one she'd seen from him. Maybe we figure that out together. The execution took place at noon, witnessed by hundreds of people who had come to see justice done. Sarah watched from a distance as the trapdoor opened, as the man who had killed her son paid the ultimate price for his crimes. She felt no satisfaction, no sense of completion, only a quiet certainty that the world was a slightly safer place for children like Thomas. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah and Nighthawk walked away from the courthouse together. They had no grand plans, no clear destination, but they had something more valuable than either. They had each other, and they had the kind of bond that could only be forged in the fires of shared suffering and purpose. Where do we go from here? Sarah asked as they reached the edge of town. West, Nighthawk replied. There are other territories, other people who need help. The army is forming special units to hunt down the rest of Thornfield's network. They've asked me to guide them. And me. That's your choice. But if you want to help, there are other mothers out there who might need to hear from someone who understands their loss, someone who fought back and won. Sarah considered this as they walked. The idea of helping other women, other families, appealed to her. It wouldn't bring Thomas back, but it might give his death meaning beyond her personal grief. I'd like that, she said finally. I'd like to help. They walked in silence for a while, leaving the town behind as they headed toward the setting sun. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with dangers and challenges they couldn't yet imagine. But they would face them together, two damaged souls who had found healing in each other's company. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Sarah felt her son's presence one last time, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a blessing. Thomas had died, but his death had led her to this moment, to this man, to this purpose. In the end, perhaps that was enough. The blood moon had brought them together, had given them both a chance at redemption. Now, under the light of ordinary stars, they would build something new from the ashes of their grief. Love had transcended death, justice had triumphed over evil, and two broken hearts had found a way to beat as one. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, and Sarah smiled. It was the sound of the wild calling to the wild, of spirits recognizing kindred spirits. She and Nighthawk were part of that wildness now, bound together by blood and purpose, and something deeper than either, the understanding that even in the darkest times, love could light the way forward. The frontier stretched before them, vast and full of possibility. Together they would meet whatever challenges it offered, carrying with them the knowledge that some bonds are stronger than death, some love deeper than loss, and some battles worth fighting even when the cost seems too high to bear. Behind them the lights of civilization flickered and dimmed. Ahead lay the great unknown, the promise of new dawns and new chances, and in their hearts, where grief had once resided alone, hope had found a place to grow. The end. Love transcends all boundaries, even the boundaries between life and death, between different worlds and different peoples. In the end, it is not the love we lose that defines us, but the love we find in the darkest of times, the love that gives us strength to carry on, and the love that connects us to others who share our pain and our hope. True love doesn't die with the beloved. It lives on in the choices we make, the battles we fight, and the new connections we forge from the ashes of our grief.